Now we've come to the last session of our conference, and that is going to be chaired by our conference chair, Dr. Wes Reisser, and they're going to discuss taking a look at the future and visualize the world map in 2050.
Thank you so much, John. Over the last 2 days, we've had some really amazing discussions and interactions here, looking at the future of both borders and the borderless world and the inherent contradictions therein. I'm thrilled to be joined on stage this evening by 3 leading women thinkers who look at our geopolitical world that we live in today, where it's headed, and they all come to us with very different perspectives and backgrounds. We have Jenna Ben-Yehuda, a longtime friend and colleague of mine. We used to work at the State Department together. Jenna is now executive director of the Truman Center. We have Dr. Joanna Regulska, the Vice Provost and Associate Chancellor for Global Affairs at the University of California at Davis. Side note, her husband was on my dissertation committee, which shows just how tiny of a world we live in. We also have the other editor we got to see half earlier, and we've saved Dr. Culcasi, who is one of the co-editors of the recent Geographical Review special issue on borders, and she is the chair of the Geography Department at West Virginia University. We'll use this final discussion to both synthesize some of the key ideas from Geography 2050 and to consider scenarios moving towards 2050. So Jenna, I want to go ahead and start with you. The Truman Center and Truman National Security Project bring together younger leaders in foreign policy and national security from across the United States, not just from Washington, D.C. and New York City, the areas where we traditionally think these leaders tend to congregate. As you travel the U.S. talking to thought leaders about America's role in the world, what are key takeaways you have about what role people see for the future for the United States within the global order? And what are the major geopolitical challenges you see outside the bubble as key to Americans' view of our future threats?
Well, thanks so much, Wes, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I should say I took my first geography class from Dr. Marie Price. Can I say that? Who hasn't aged a day and worked with Lee Schwartz. So it's a real joy to be back with some friends of long standing. I won't say old friends. So the Truman National Security Project is a nationwide membership organization of next generation national security professionals, which means in the field of national security, which can be a bit long in the tooth, our average member age means that we're among the younger folks in the room. We're average age of 35. For our members. So Pete Buttigieg is a member you might recognize, many other members of Congress, but these are folks who were leaders in their local communities, and we have 16 chapters all around the country, not just on the coasts. And so as I travel around and I talk to our chapters in Detroit and in Chicago and in San Diego, I think there's no better education to understand how foreign policy and national security play out beyond Washington than being in these communities. And there are a couple things that I think really stand out. And the Chicago Council on Global Affairs did some really outstanding polling on this, which I would commend to you for those of you who are interested about how these attitudes play out across the United States. So I think one of the big takeaways is that, we talk about, in our field, we hear foreign policy, national security, not an issue in the elections. It's not a focus, it's about healthcare, it's about jobs. But when you talk to Americans about the things that they care about how much they're paying for goods, they care about their accessibility to labor markets, they care about the quality of the water that they drink and the air that they breathe. And at Truman, we believe very much that, as I think many of you here share, borders don't really matter when it comes to some of these things. The organizing principles behind them and the solutions that we'll need to promulgate certainly do, but these are transnational issues that really have deep-seated roots and governance challenges for America as it engages with countries the world over. And so when we talk to people about, if you say, and you look at the polling, if you say, do you care about NATO? Folks in the polls come back with a blink, blink. Not a lot of big NATO fans or NATO awareness outside of the Beltway, maybe, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But if you say, do you think it's better if you have to go to war, to go alone or to go with friends? Everybody says, go with friends. Absolutely, you should go with friends. So if we talk in terms, I think, that people understand, and we talk to the American people in direct and explicit ways about what global engagement means, people get it, because it's about preserving US interests in the world. I think the real challenge at this moment in time is that there is a lot of competition for what the rules of engagement look like. And so what we at the Truman Center do quite a bit of work on is talk about what the trade-offs of retreating from US global engagement really look like. And if we think about what the global order is, which has largely been shaped by the United States, everything from the post-1947 national security architecture to the conventions that we operate under, they're largely US rules of the road. And so pulling back from global engagement really means ceding the giant pen that writes a lot of these rules. And we now have situations in which, unlike with the Soviet Union, for example, when we had a bipolar world, we have a multipolar world, a return to some great power competition. But the Chinese, for example, we talk a lot about this quite a bit, with surveillance in particular. We've got folks who are angling to rewrite the rules of the road, but in ways that affect consumer economies that are outside the normal frame of governance. So just one of the many challenges that we think about.
Thanks, Jenna. Joanna, among other projects, you have been heavily involved in global learning projects that are trying to bring international perspectives to classrooms and build a globally literate next generation. Considering that we have many AP high school teachers in the audience here whose mission is to do just this, what do you see as some of the most important things educators and also those in the other sectors here in the room can do to build a globally literate next generation that will be prepared to address the myriad challenges with diverse perspectives that we've been discussing over the past 2 days here?
Thank you, Wes, and I'm glad that Michael delivered on the committee. So thank you so much for inviting me. I think the question of global learning has been coming across many of the presentations. We're actually saying global learning is at the heart of our future. Future of our strategies, future of our conflicts, futures of our education. So I want to talk a little bit about what do we mean, or what I mean, what my university means about the global learning, and how we can really think very broadly. This is not only about the students. This is about learners. We are all learners. If we are really preparing ourselves for the future, we all have to step back and think about what is this world right now presenting to us, and what is the future going to be, and how we can actually learn more about how we're going to strategize, how we're going to engage, how we're going to collaborate, what are we going to do in the classroom, what are we going to do outside the classroom. So I think challenge is for us to begin really think and move away from sitting in a disciplinary silos, from sitting in our classroom, from thinking, oh, I'm just doing this, or I'm just doing that. I think global learning is going to have to be in a much more understood from a much more holistic perspective that really cultivates who we are, what our students are bringing, what our learners are bringing to the table. Each of us has our own identity, racial, ethnic, age, sexual orientation, socioeconomic, and so forth. So each of us was shaped by certain conditions. These conditions are changing. But because we were shaped by those conditions, that means that we are reacting in a certain particular way. And our actions are very much affecting the actions of others. So our awareness of who we are, our awareness of how we are acting, has to be reflected in what we do. And I know in a certain way this is sort of sounds, well, of course. But it's a one thing to say, of course, it's the other thing to actually start doing this. And I think global learning is precisely of thinking, moving, for example, away from just thinking about study abroad. Global learning is not about sending a certain group of students to participate in study abroad, because that is privileging only certain group of students. What about DACA students? What about students who are veterans? What about students who are on limited socioeconomic means? What about students who are single parents? For them, study abroad it's not an option. For many of them, actually, it's not even a possibility. So how do we provide global learning here? How we accept that global, international, intercultural is part of who we are, what we do, and every day. How are we going to rethink what we provide and what we talk about and how we talk in a classroom? K through 12, college, university. There has to be a shift in the paradigm of how we think about this. And it has to be a shift in paradigm in terms of how do we do. And I think the discussion today about the Sustainable Development Goals actually was very useful, because Sustainable Development Goals really provide us with the opportunity to think differently and provide us with the opportunity to maybe focus our attention on some goals, but not necessarily on the others. The Sustainable Development Goals provide us an extremely broad and challenging framework. But as today Samantha Power talked about, shrink the change. We can focus on some of those goals and not necessarily in all of them, but we can also develop strategies to address them. I think one of the misconceptions about Sustainable Development Goals is also that it's so much about down there, somewhere away. And very rarely we think about Sustainable Development Goals, it's up to us. In fact, as was mentioned, United States is only 35 in the long list of countries. We're doing very poorly. And in fact, in this country, we even don't talk too much about Sustainable Development Goals. When I travel around the world, everybody is engaged. Everybody took a piece. Everybody is focusing on something. People are taking action. People are moving to do something about it in their small way. In the United States, you rarely hear, although I would say New York City map itself against Sustainable Development Goals. Los Angeles map itself against, and several other cities across the country are already doing this. So I think we have an opportunity, and that framework provides an opportunity for everybody, because everybody, every school, every business, every industry can actually engage and pick up what is the most important or relevant, or maybe the lowest hanging fruits for that matter. It almost doesn't matter, but it does matter that we consciously articulate. It does matter that we intentionally do it. It does matter that we think about how the next generation of those who we are educating right now could be actually the one that will be solving these problems and other problems, but we have to educate them to that.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And I'm going to turn next to Karen. Much of your focus has been investigating geopolitical issues from the perspective of the most vulnerable communities, especially those involving refugees and other migrants. How can we use the ground-up perspective, especially from those that are most vulnerable and therefore most likely to migrate, to address these challenges, be they fleeing conflict, climate change, economic disruption, or other factors?
Okay, thank you, Wes. I'm not sure I'm going to really be able to speak to each of the images that are on the screen right now, but I'll see what I can do. So good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and thank you, Wes, for organizing having us here. So to address this question about starting at the point of vulnerable people, it's been a really wonderful conference for me for the last day and a half, learning about so many of the tools that practitioners and other geographers are using, geospatial technologies, the way in which statistics are being used, of course the map, and we've seen a lot of these things, and I've learned immensely from that. We've also had these great moments, and we've had speakers talking about the more human side of the work that we're doing concerning borders or a borderless world. We had Samantha Power mentioning the story about the young Syrian woman who really just worries the next day about brushing her teeth and going to school. Patricia Urkamp this morning talked to us about PTSD. Yesterday, Emily Scott reminded us that we need to not always start at the technology phase, and we not always look at top down. And the woman who was just on stage just before we came in here, I think her name was Janine, ending with talking about these ideas of empathy. And that's exactly where I position myself. I very much engage in the kind of humanizing project, and I embrace all these other forms and methods of the production of knowledge and understanding, disseminating knowledge. But again, I really focus very much on the person, and that's, I think, kind of getting to the question here, like what does focusing on the vulnerable person actually do for us? So I have spent off and on for the last about 6 years or so, I've been going to Jordan, and I started a project first working with Palestinian refugees, talking to them about how they actually have a sense of belonging and how place matters in their daily life. The war in Syria broke out about 2 years into that project, and then they started doing research more specifically on Syrian refugees in Jordan, and with a very specific focus on Syrian women refugees. And through that work, I have been utterly humbled, and I've gained a new perspective on the world, learning particularly from these Syrian women, the Palestinians as well, but the Syrian women particularly, have really, in a lot of ways, changed the way I look at the world. It's changing the way that I look at my children. They are vulnerable people, most certainly. They've experienced immense trauma. They live precarious lives. That happens at the border, but that also happens through their daily lives as women who are often in a conservative country, women who are often responsible for getting water at the camps. These are women that, again, they live very precarious lives. But at the same time, and what's important and what I really want to underscore is that these are not victims. Yes, they have been victimized, but they're not victims. These are incredibly powerful women that have changed my worldview. These are incredibly powerful women who have done things like get a master's degree. I met a woman named Senna. Senna was fortunate that when she fled, they were able to bring some money with them from Syria into Jordan, and they were able to buy themselves a modest an apartment. She lived in this apartment with her husband and her 6 children. I had heard stories about her from other Syrian women who just talked about her amazing work that she was doing in the community in Jordan, and I had wanted to interview her for a while, but she was so busy, it was hard to set up a time. And finally, we were able to meet, my research assistant and I were able to set up a time to meet Senna. When we got to her home, and she wasn't there. She was busy. But her husband welcomed us in, and we sat there for a while, thinking she was going to be arriving soon. We had tea, we had coffee. Her husband was incredibly hospitable with us. And eventually, she shows up at the door, and 5 of the children come rushing to the door, hugging her, they're kissing, there's so much love. I mean, things that we, hopefully we experience on a very daily basis, she was experiencing at that moment. And then we had the opportunity to go into the small 1-bedroom that they actually had and talk privately with her. And within 10 minutes of that conversation, her husband came in with her baby daughter so that she could breastfeed. She was absolutely amazing, juggling all these demands as a mother. She was also coping with all of the trauma that she dealt with fleeing Syria, knowing that she had family that died. She was actually a teacher at a school, and her school was bombed, and she shared that story of complete and total trauma with us. But she was also studying for her master's degree, and I was able to follow up with her a year later, and indeed, she got her master's degree. So this woman who I think is often portrayed, on glossy brochures sometimes at aid organizations as, some victimized Muslim woman, this woman was the absolute embodiment of power and strength. So yes, she is vulnerable, but she's also incredibly empowered. And I wonder a lot, perhaps too much, I wonder if Donald Trump ever sat down and met Senna, if he would have issued a travel ban to all Syrian nationals in January of 2017. And of course, I'm not naive about that. I know there's a lot of other factors to consider, but it is an amazing thing, these women that I met. I could tell you more stories about some of the women I met, the women who were in their 20s having their first child in the Zatri refugee camp, who were able to thrive. I mean, just absolutely stunning women. And for the Palestinians as well. In Jordan, the Palestinians are the entrepreneurs. They are the business owners. They are the thriving ones within the economy. Most Jordanians who are of Jordanian origin, they actually often work for the state. And although they can make a decent income, they're not the ones creating businesses and creating new jobs. Palestinians are amazingly entrepreneurial in Jordan. And again, I wonder, how would Donald Trump feel? Would he have cut all funding to UNRWA if he had ever met some of the Palestinians that I met, and how successful and strong that they actually are? So again, these are certainly vulnerable populations, but I also find immense strength in the work that they do.
Thanks, Karen. And I think one overriding theme that we've gotten is we've seen a lot from both the top down and the bottom up over this conference, but the fact that we've been able to bring individual voices and experiences throughout these couple days, I think has been a very important part of this discussion. When we think about the world map just as a bunch of lines and puzzle pieces and great powers playing a game of chess, we forget about the people on the ground, right there on the front line, who are actually the most impacted by these decisions that are being made oftentimes thousands of miles away. I'm now going to throw the next couple questions to the panel writ large. And for this first one, the fields of geography and its related disciplines that study issues related to the changing world map and foreign policy more broadly are heavily dominated by men. And because of that, I'm so pleased that I'm the only one on the stage right now. And I'd like to pitch to all of you just to get your perspective on how we ensure all these various themes and challenges we've discussed over the past couple days, from global trade to border security to refugees, surveillance, et cetera, include female voices at the table, and what special role women and the feminist perspective as well can bring to understanding these myriad challenges.
I'll start. So, thank you so much for being in minority. That really makes the difference. In fact, colleagues of mine in Australia at the University of Sydney proposed a pledge to the administration of the whole university that they will never participate in a panel that it's always male panel, from the top down. And just the fact that it came from top down make a huge difference in a way the university began to function. People became far more aware and concerned that you can't just have one majority. In a certain way, it's usually majority of men. The issue of diversity, the issue of equity, the issue of inclusion is still and continue to be so much, not maybe visible, but it's really invisible in many ways. And I think part of it is a challenge to every single one of us. We have to speak, we have to be conscious, and especially when we're doing work with refugees, with vulnerable population, with the population which for a variety of reasons is marginalized, we have to make sure that the diversity is really at the core of what we do. Similarly in our classrooms, as we do the public speaking, as we teach, as we write, as we talk, as we build partnerships, as we build collaborations, as we communicate. I think it's part of the parcel of what we do and what we have to do. And part of it is part of that global learning that I was talking about. That diversity, inclusion, and equity, it's really at the core of what we need to accept for the future.
I like to think of diversity as big data. You know, we talk a lot about big data. Do you have a data scientist? What are we going to do with big data? We love data. And if we think about the presence and inclusion of women, of people of color, and other traditionally underrepresented groups, what they represent is data, is perspective, is a different lens of experience. And if we think about what additional data means for our decision making, whatever our field, we know that more data leads to better outcomes. And so having people in the room, incorporating those perspectives, and creating the conditions under which women can thrive and feel welcome in those areas, we know leads to greater outcomes. When women are at peace tables, we know that those peace agreements are far more durable than when women are not included. Why is this shocking? Women are half the population.
They're good negotiators.
And so when we do this kind of stakeholder engagement, surprise, it's useful because we have more people bought into the experience. But you know, as Joanna rightly notes, there are things that all of us can do. I like to say that everybody can lead on diversity. You don't have to be the head of an organization. It helps. Top-down leadership is very effective and catalyzing and makes this change happen faster. But you're not off the hook. Every single person in this room can do something. It starts from things like, why aren't there women on the panel? Or I just don't serve on panels where there aren't women or people of color. That's just my own personal policy. Or for women, when I always say to the women in my field I know, find your five. And this is something that our male counterparts can do as well. If somebody asks you to speak, if somebody asks you to contribute, and you can't do it for whatever reason, give them the name of a woman. And give them five, because women are disproportionately tapped for the specific perspective. Women are often really, really busy. But if you find your five and you have your list of go-to people all the time, you're going to help create that change. Build flexible workplaces, create space for people to nurse and do other things, create the institutional structures that say to people, we want you here and we're going to make it easier for you to be here. There are lots of great models, things like Gender Champions and Nuclear Policy. I encourage you to look it up, organizations that are helping to lead on these issues, where you can see the kinds of pledges that organizations are taking. This was started out of the United Nations in Geneva and has inspired the multilateral community to really raise the bar on inclusion. I'm part of the steering committee of a group called the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. We have signatures from 15 of the presidential campaigns for president in 2020 in this country saying that they are committed to having parity, gender parity, on their campaigns and in their future administrations. Not bad. Hold them to account. They're good models, and I think they could be applied in this field as well.
Yeah, I agree with Jen entirely that when you bring women to the table, discussion often, it does change. And when you're looking not at the academic kind of side of it or at sitting at a panel, but when you're actually looking and transitions towards peace, bringing women in is so important. What often happens, however, and here's the kind of dark side of it, this happened in Afghanistan, this happened in Iraq, this happened in Palestine after the first Intifada. The men have left to fight wars, sometimes they're injured, they're not capable of leadership, and women often take leadership during times of conflict when men are fighting wars. And then often what happens is the men come back, and that power dynamic is then reversed again. So women often will have immense amounts of power, and women's movements during war is incredibly strong, but then they often then lose that power when the men come back from war. So I think this to be, in these cases where some of you are you're practitioners and you actually do come to the peace negotiation tables at times, to really remember the importance of keeping women at that table, because they were the leaders of these things. And then the other kind of side of it, is the more kind of academic, sitting on the panel side, like we're doing now. And yes, of course, it's lovely to be part of an all-female panel right now. But there is a difference between a